Hey guys, welcome to the Social Studies Judincast, episode 6 for Social Studies 10-1. This is the final Judincast for this particular chapter, which is chapter 7, where we're looking at the foundations of historical globalization, and ultimately we're going to be looking at imperialism, which is a major force of historical globalization. And we've looked at a number of things so far. We've looked at the Silk Road, how the Silk Road was an early form of globalization on the Eurasian continent, where ideas, culture, products, materials, etc. were exchanged. We looked at the development of mercantilism. And mercantilism was the economic system used by European powers during and after the Age of Exploration, that European powers are setting up colonies and companies all over the world. And they're using the mercantilist system. And you may recall the mercantilist system is focused on the accumulation of wealth for the state, for the monarch. It's a highly regulated system that utilizes monopolies. They don't want competition. They don't want economic freedom. The goal is to set up a system that money can essentially be siphoned back to the monarch, to the state. This is the motivation for why European powers were colonizing the world in the 1700s. Then we looked at the development of capitalism. That capitalism is a relatively new economic system. It develops after mercantilism. The theories of capitalism are laid out in the late 1700s, but it really takes off in the 1800s. And like I said, it replaces mercantilism. And it's a natural evolution of mercantilism because while the mercantilist system was being set up and its focus was to create wealth for the monarchs of various European states, there were a number of people that were involved in mercantilist systems, such as merchants, traders, various types of business people, that naturally they start to desire a system where they can make profit for themselves, where they can have more economic freedom to create profit for themselves. And there are going to be a number of people that are interested, of course, in the ideas of capitalism. And capitalism is an economic system which gives everyone in society economic freedom. It embraces the free market, where people can pursue their economic self-interest. They can accumulate wealth, they can accumulate private property, and ultimately pursue their self-interest freely without control by the government, which you saw under the mercantilist system was a much more regulated, regimented system than capitalism. And capitalism goes hand in hand with our last topic, industrialization. That European society industrializes in the 1800s, and it forever changes our lives. And the industrialization first starts with the harnessing of power, that once they're able to harness steam power, they can power various types of machines that can be engaged in mass production. And this leads to the rapid industrialization of European society. And it's closely linked to capitalism because capitalism frees up entrepreneurs to pursue their self-interest, to open up a business, to pursue profit, to compete with other companies and individuals. And all of this expands globalization. That the capitalist system creates global trade networks around the world, just like mercantilism did before, just like the Silk Road did before. It also creates global supply systems where there's the exchange of raw materials that are required in various manufacturing centers. So industrialization really fuels globalization. Along with capitalism, which also fuels globalization. But the main topic of this chapter is actually imperialism. And imperialism is closely connected to mercantilism, to capitalism, to industrialization. So let's take a look at imperialism. And imperialism is also so closely associated with Eurocentrism, and I'll talk about what Eurocentrism means in a minute. So what is imperialism? Imperialism is an association between peoples that intentionally benefits one people over another. This is often accomplished by laying claim to territories inhabited by indigenous or non-indigenous peoples, seizing land and resources through conflict and warfare, and in imposing political control. So if you take a look at this image here, you can see imperialism in action. You can see the British grab bag, the German grab bag. I believe this is the Russian grab bag. They are grabbing territory. And in the 1800s, that is the era of European imperialism. They are imperializing the planet essentially. By the late 1800s, there was only two small parts of Africa that weren't controlled by European powers, Ethiopia and Liberia. Everywhere else, 95% of it was controlled by European powers. And imperialism was fueled by first mercantilism. That, of course, there's a desire to expand colonies, to acquire more resources, of which can be turned into profit. Then capitalism, because capitalism also requires an input of resources. And then also industrialization, because industrialization requires an input of resources. So capitalism, mercantilism, industrialization ultimately come together to fuel European imperialism. It's why in the 1800s they expand all European powers expand all over the world. And Eurocentrism is a belief that European worldview is superior to all others. And this is a major component of imperialism because the Europeans see themselves as superior. And if they're superior, of course, they should lay claim to territories all over the world. And then they should seize land and resources from these territories. And in the process, spread civilization. So this map here gives you a pretty good idea of European imperialism. That it's a if you take a look at his legend here, it shows you who controlled which parts of the world. Britain, red. France, just green color. Germany controls territories. Little country of Belgium controls territories. Spain, Portugal. Now, even these areas here, of course, they're independent at this time in the 1800s, United States, Southern America, but they were, of course, colonized by European powers years earlier. But in the age of European imperialism in the 1800s is really focused on the expansion of European spheres of control over Africa and Asia. And imperialism is very much connected to global trade. And global trade is an important part of, at first, mercantilism, then, of course, capitalism and industrialization. So all these things come together to fuel European imperialism in the 1800s, where raw materials are being shipped back to Europe. Europe is making manufactured goods from these raw materials, which are being sold all over the world. So there's three types of imperialism that you should be familiar with. The first type is a colony that we've talked about. So a colony is a territory that belonged to a European country. It was completely subject to that European territory. For example, colonists, and there's hundreds of examples, colonists settled in 1684 on the island of Cayenne in what became French Guiana. It becomes a European colony. It totally under control of European power. There's also what was called protectorates. So it was an area that maintained its own sovereignty, which means independence, but was guided by a European country. Example, Germany declared Namibia, which is Southwest Africa, as its protectorate in 1884. There was also the idea of spheres of influence. Sphere of influence was a region in which a European country attempted to control both politics and economic systems without um, it being a colony. They would just try to influence that country in their direction. So, example, Great Britain was economically involved in trade of China from 1750. China was never colonized. It never became a protectorate, but China was under the influence of the British. And Japan was never colonized, for example, was never became a protectorate necessarily, but it was under the American sphere of influence. So all three, whether it's a colony, a protectorate, a sphere of influence, are all examples of European imperialism. They're trying to exert economic, social, political control over various parts of the world for the purpose of ultimately achieving economic benefits. So, what are the origins of European imperialism? Well, during the 17th and 18th centuries, Europeans were very competitive with one another as they're exploring the world. Each nationality wanted to be bigger, better than the others. It's a prestige race. They believed that to gain prestige, a country needed both wealth and power. To get wealth and power, you had to have colonies. If we don't have enough colonies as our neighbor, we are going to lose this prestige race. We're not going to have the same wealth and power as them, and we could be under threat. Trade was crucial to the success of imperialism. Through trade, a European power could increase its wealth, which in turn increased its prestige. European entrepreneurs were very successful in generating wealth through trade because they exploited the people and natural resources of other colonies. And this happens during the age of mercantilism and also under the emergence of capitalism. Europeans consistently repressed attempts by colonists to industrialize. They didn't want them to be competitors in the world markets for manufactured goods. Europeans wanted the colonies to be a source of raw materials, to be sent back to Europe to be made into manufactured goods, which would be sold. Capitalism, like I said, is closely connected to it. During the 1800s, a global capitalist economy began to develop, and we, of course, have a global capitalist economy today. The activities of European capitalists spread far and wide. They sought out their raw materials to feed their factories, and in doing so, create demands essentially on their various governments around the world to expand their empires, to gain more access to raw materials that could be used to fuel their factories. Some of the impacts of imperialism. And we're going to look more at this in other chapters, but just very generally, European imperialism changed the way of both indigenous and non-indigenous peoples forever. In North and South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, Central Asia, indigenous peoples were displaced by European settlement and colonies. In some cases, indigenous peoples adapted their ways of life to function with the European economic system. So the impacts are broad, they're deep, ultimately significant, and it is more of a topic for the next chapter. So this bit on imperialism here at the end of this chapter is meant to be just a bit of an intro to it. So that concludes the chapter 7 notes on foundations of historical globalization and imperialism, which is one of the major foundations. So stop it right there, guys. Take care.